We're ready for John Bates now, who, being from northern Wisconsin, he's our sort of treasure of the Northwoods, so it's really exciting to have him here. And John is the author of 9 books, and he's a contributor to 7 other books. And all of these books focus on the natural history of the Northwoods. He's worked as a naturalist in Wisconsin's Northwoods for 30 years, leading an array of trips, all designed to help people further understand the remarkable diversity and beauty of nature and our place within it. His most recent book is Our Living Ancestors, The History and Ecology of Old-Growth Forests in Wisconsin and Where to Find Them. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
I'll turn down the lights a little bit.
Okay. Good morning. Glad to be here with you all. Thanks for coming. My desire is to give you a little bit of background on the history of how we got to where we are today, which is having only about 0.2% of our original old growth left in our state. Why did we do that? There's a whole bunch of reasons that make sense in the context of looking at the time. So we'll talk about some of those, talk about maybe what we could do in the future if we want to do some restoration, and where some of the best sites are that are left. Specifically for paddlers, since this is a lake conference, so trying to combine the best hikes that you can do while at the same time paddling somewhere in the same area. So we'll run through those things. Also knowing how much expertise is in any given crowd, particularly the kind of people to come to this conference. I'm more than happy for folks to interject any information, questions, better stories, better jokes, whatever you got. Feel free to add them, make it more of a symbiotic thing than me just yammering away at you on my own. All righty. You always have to start with the Gary Larson cartoon. That's a requirement pretty much in any talk I give these days. I spent about 15 years wandering around northern Wisconsin with my wife, some with my youngest daughter, and with our mini Australian Shepherd, who has seen more old growth than any dog in Wisconsin, trying to figure out where all the sites were that we have. And I certainly am finding out I missed some by different people coming and telling me things. But that's kind of the genesis of the book. The book was old growth in its own right because it took so darn long to get it done, but finally came out last year. Whoops, hit too many buttons. So I want to just start with some myths about forests of northern Wisconsin. The myth number 1 is that a squirrel could get on a tree in New York and never have to touch the ground all the way to Minnesota because it was all old growth. Well, that's bunk. There was a whole lot of natural disturbance going on, and then there were people living here for 10,000 plus years, Native American people, and they were altering the forests all the way from New York to us, of course. So that squirrel would have jumped off those trees many, many times and run along the ground along the way. So the estimate is maybe 2/3 to possibly 3/4 of northern Wisconsin was old growth, but the rest was in various stages of regrowth due to natural disturbance, wind, fire, disease, and Native Americans altering the forest. The second myth is it was an untouched virgin forest. I love this quote by William Cronin, a professor, fabulous professor at UW-Madison. I'll just read it if you don't mind. There's been no timeless wilderness in a state of perfect changelessness, no climax forest in permanent stasis. It's tempting to believe that when Europeans arrived in the New World, they confronted virgin land, the forest primeval, a wilderness, which had existed for eons uninfluenced by human hands. Nothing could be further from the truth. In Francis Jennings' telling phrase, the land was less virgin than it was widowed. And in his saying widowed, he's referring, of course, to the diseases that preceded we Euro-Americans as we came westward into Wisconsin, our smallpox and, oh gosh, a whole bunch of other diseases that killed probably the estimate's 80 to 90% of original people being here. So the land was certainly not virgin by dint of people being here for 8,000 plus years, altering the forest, but it was also widowed by the time we got here. Native Americans take great exception to our calling this a wilderness, pristine, untouched, all that sort of thing, because they were utilizing somewhere around 1/3 of the total flora of the Northwoods for everything. And the list is there with many more things one could add. So certainly a lot of use. And I think one of the things that I found really interesting that a lot of folks don't realize, I think, is the Native Americans were using fire in northern Wisconsin, probably not as much as they were using in the prairie country down in Madison area, but certainly using it in the North Woods. So this is a state natural area right across the Manitowish River from my home. I live in southern Iron County in the big city of Manitowish, population 29 people, little crossroads. Anyway, this fellow from the DNR, Jed Minier, who I've not met but have stolen his statistics, I hope he's okay with this, found this red pine across the river from our house with this fire scar on it. I've been showing this fire scar to people for 30 years saying, gosh, there was a fire here, I don't know how, when, and all that. He made this little cut down here at the bottom of the tree, went in all the way to the pith, pulled out a tree cookie, and found out that red pine's pith it began in 1805, so it's a 214-year-old red pine at this point. But look at all those fire scars, 1833, 46, 55, 64, 77, and 95. And Euro-American white folks didn't show up in our area up in Iron County basically till the 1880s. So why was it possible those were all natural fires? Possible, I think, certainly the better explanation is that Native Americans were utilizing fire basically every decade, and for what purpose? I don't know if I have I don't have a slide to that. Berries for one. Where do you all go to pick berries? You go out in the full sun where you're going to find the raspberries, strawberries, blueberries, blackberries, so forth. So you're not going to find them in the deep woods. It's also better for hunting because you have that new fresh growth, which is better for deer, rabbits, grouse, so forth, so on. Whole bunch of reasons why Native Americans would have been burning in the north, and when my wife and I speak to any Native American elders in our area, they say, oh yeah, we were burning all the time. And in fact, several of them say to us, we live right next to the Lac de Flambeau Reservation, they say that to the south of that reservation, they always called that prairie because they burned in there so doggone much, which I find fascinating because one wouldn't think of quote, quote, prairie being in the North Woods, but Native Americans were utilizing fire. To what extent, no one knows because we don't have written records, but you have oral histories and people saying, yeah, it was occurring, and then you have these fire scar data that you can work with. Myth number 3 is that most of the northern Wisconsin was a pinery. Really, really far from the truth. Most of northern Wisconsin was a hemlock hardwoods forest with some super canopy white pines. When the first surveyors came through and then the cruisers trying to figure out where the best pines were, apparently they would say if there was one big pine per acre, they called that a pinery. That's in a number of literature sources, which I find pretty amazing. So pines were just so incredibly valuable. They're so much bigger than all the other trees in the North Woods, and they floated down rivers, which was kind of handy, to say the least, before the railroads came through. So we believed that most of the North Woods was a pinery. It was not the case at all. And when you look at a map of the early vegetation pre-settlement of Wisconsin, that red up there is the pinery of northern Wisconsin. That's where I live in all the sand of Vilas and Oneida and southern Iron counties, where pine is a drought-resistant species, does really well out competing sugar maple and basswood and hemlocks and so forth in those sites. But the vast majority of the rest of that green all up there was hemlock hardwoods. So here's an actual graph done by David Mlodinoff, a forest ecologist out of Madison, looking at survey data back in the 1860s, 50s and 60s when all that was done by the surveyors, and showing that eastern hemlock was the most dominant tree in northern Wisconsin, followed by sugar maple and yellow birch, and then white pine. White pine was only 9 to 10% of the total forest in the North Woods. So out of our 36 million acres in the state, 20 million acres originally were forested land, about 16 million acres now, but about 2/3 of that were what we would define today as hemlock hardwoods, and only about 2 million acres were dominated by pines, about 10%. So most of northern Wisconsin was this hemlock hardwood. So an additional myth was that all the North Woods is the same. Across the upper Midwest, Michigan actually had more pine than we did. That dark green, now we've changed colors here. That's pine forest, is the dark green here. Dark green for us is the pineries. Lighter green is the northern hemlock hardwoods. Then you get over into Minnesota where it's drier and you end up with a whole lot more aspen and birch because that's a fire-based system. We're a wind disturbance system in most of northern Wisconsin, except where we have super poor sands, and that's jack pine, pine barrens on those particularly really bad sites. But again, It changes as you get drier going west. Hemlock falls completely out. If you go into Minnesota trying to find eastern hemlock, good luck. There's virtually none there. There's certainly no beach going across Wisconsin. It's interesting to see these ranges of different trees. So why did we nearly cut it all down? Because wood was the way, and wood was in the way. So wood was used for everything from cradle, literally, to coffin, literally, and all things in between. But it was also in the way. So if you can put yourself in the shoes of this very happy family that has shown up in the Black River Falls area, God, how grim they look. And I would look grim too if I had just showed up and said, oh my Lord, we got to plant potatoes, in a week or whatever. How are we going to pull that off? Wood was in the way because you had to plant those potatoes next week or in the spring or whatever, and you had to clear all this land. You had to get all that slash off the land. So it was in the way. And there's some amazing statistics, and I don't think I've included in this particular version of this slideshow, but anywhere from 20 to 50% of all of the pine, the white pine in Wisconsin, was actually lost to fire before it ever made it to the mill, because all these farmers were burning slash. If you've ever seen a clear cut, you know how many branches are on the ground, and how are you going to get rid of that? You got your one mule or your one ox or whatever you got, and you got to plant right away. You're going to use a match to clear that land. So when we talk about wood being in the way and wood being the way, it's interesting to look at the great swarming. So here we are in 1830 with the first census, which was probably just white males, right? 3,000 folks. 1840, we 10 times that, somehow ended up with 30,000. We become a state in 1848. And by 1850, we have 305,000 people. By 1870, we have 1 million people. So if you're a Native American, you're going, what in the hell just happened, right? It was a locust swarm of settlers descending upon the state, but now you have 1 million people who are using wood for everything. Everything, all fuel, building every home, just everything you can think of is being made out of wood, and then you have it in the way for anyone who's trying to farm. So suddenly if you can translate 1 million people and all that use of wood, it begins to give you a sense of how we had to cut as much as we did. I like this particular slide because it gives you a sense of how much wood in any given year was going down our rivers. Can you see those 3 people right there? There's a woman there, and a woman there, and a guy in a suit coat there. What in the world they were doing out of this log jam, I have no clue. This log jam was, it's either 15 miles long and 30 feet high, or 30 miles long and 15 feet high. One of those, but it's an immensely long log jam in 1 year on one river in northern Wisconsin. It gives you just a sense of the volume of timber that was being cut. And I still would love to know the story of why they're out there. Someone needs to tell me. They're dressed in their Sunday finest. Is this what you did on Sunday afternoon? Well, let's go wander around on the log jam because it would be fun. Think of how much sound that would make when that log jam let go. I mean, the thundering sound would be amazing. So when we at a lakes conference, we should consider as well the gouging of riverbanks. All of that wood going down any given river widened those shorelines and shallowed, therefore, the rivers, because you're widening it with still the same volume of water. So many, if not most, of our rivers in northern Wisconsin are still impacted because that morphology of those rivers was so dramatically altered a century ago. Along with cutting all that pine for building construction, and then following when the railroads came in, all of the hardwoods, we were also cutting hemlock trees by the tens of millions for hemlock tanning. Hemlocks, if you don't know, have 10% tannic acid in the bark. And we had a lot of tanneries in Wisconsin. I don't know, you probably can't see this map very well, but where you have these darker counties, that's 5 tanneries or more per county. Where you have the lighter, that's 1 to 5 tanneries in those counties. And we had tanneries up in northern Wisconsin that aren't on that map. There were, I don't know how many tanneries in Wisconsin, but many, many, many thousands of people were employed in these tanneries. Here's the guys cutting the bark in June and July, getting eaten alive by black flies and mosquitoes. What a terrible job. Sending all that bark via railroad cars and then onto schooners and so forth down to all the the tanneries, and here's the very happy people working at the tannery. You can't see their faces, but this was one of the worst jobs you can imagine. But if you're an immigrant, and it's a job, right? Milwaukee led the world in tanning. Anybody from Milwaukee here? Yeah, Milwaukee was the big cheese in tanning. The world walked on Milwaukee leather was the statement often made. In 1907, Milwaukee tanned approximately 2 million hides, and the ratio of hemlock to hides is 1 to 1. So it took one hemlock tree in general, on average, to tan one hide. So if Milwaukee tanned 2 million hides alone in 1907, you can imagine the number of hemlocks that were being cut. So tens of millions, there's no way to quantify that. Hemlock was, I showed you that graph earlier, hemlock being the most dominant tree, the most prevalent tree in northern Wisconsin, now represents about 1% of northern Wisconsin. Kind of a ghost tree in some respects. There's all that slash I was talking about. Fire is the pillar lighting the path of empire on its westward way. You had to get rid of that slash, and you did it through fire. So the axe was the right hand, and the match was the left hand. A couple boys out in the field, stumps. And this is a long quote. You're never supposed to do anything like this when you're giving a talk, but I love this quote, so I'm going to read it to you, so you're going to have to suffer through it anyway, because I get to control this thing. So the Detroit Post, it's 1881. There's fires going like crazy throughout the upper Midwest. Michigan's burning like crazy. Wisconsin's burning like crazy. Minnesota's burning like crazy. And here's the Chamber of Commerce response to it by the local paper in Detroit. All these fires are a chance for new settlers. Where the fires have raged, the forests have been killed, the underbrush burned, and the ground pretty effectively cleared. There are square miles and whole townships where the earth is bare of everything except a light covering of ashes. And other square miles where all that is needed to complete the clearing is to gather up a few scattered chunks per acre and finish burning them. These lands are now in such a condition they're ready for seeding. The trees, the underbrush, and all the impediments to agriculture it usually costs so much in toil for the pioneer to remove with that one ox, one mule, have been swept away, and the rich land lies open and ready, cleared for the settler. There are other great advantages too. The insects and forest pests of the farmer are nearly all extinct. There will be no potato bugs, no weevils, armyworms, very few birds or squirrels, thank God, for several years to come on these lands. There can be no more fires because there's no more brush or swamps to burn. So not only did we cut northern Wisconsin as thoroughly as we could possibly cut it, we burned it again and again and again. And most of these fires were combination fires, a farmer setting his slash on fire or her slash on fire over here, and somebody with their 40 over here setting a fire, and they're coming together. The Peshtigo fire, if I'm not mistaken, was 4 or 5 fires coming together in 1871, set almost certainly by farmers in the whole region and or by trains going through, shooting off sparks. But anyway, all this massive Holocaust fires, they were called, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The whole idea was the plow was to follow the axe. So here's, the left side is the vision. If you're a settler, again, put yourself in the shoes of somebody coming to northern Wisconsin in 1880, 1890. You're either from New England and you're coming this way, or you're coming directly over from Europe. And you're facing this, and you have absolutely no clue what to do with that, right? And most of us would have today, in 2019, no clue what to do with that. And here was your vision. That's what you wanted. And that was the Jeffersonian dream, to create this pastoral landscape of all of the upper Midwest with people on small farms. Bit of a hoax for northern Wisconsin. Dean William Henry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Agriculture created this handbook for the home seeker. You can read the whole thing on the internet. Just Google it, and it's available. It's really fascinating to read. 50,000 copies sent over to Europe, telling everybody, come on over here because crops will never fail. The land is rich clay bottom, making it the most productive hayland in America, just as good as those famed bluegrass lands in Kentucky. Now that's from the Bluegrass Land Company, which was in St. Germain in Vilas County. If you've ever been to St. Germain, it's all sand. And there is no way in hell you're going to have the most productive hayland in America. So I think there's a lot of fraud going on. And I think there was a whole lot of also just misinformation and misunderstanding, because people so wanted the North Country to be farmland that they just couldn't see the truth out in front of them, a bit like climate change today. You just don't want it to happen, to be that way, and so we're going to resist. Sent trains up here trying to show people how to plant and pull stumps and all this stuff, and all the best efforts of the university and everybody possible trying to make this northern Wisconsin into a farmland, and by 1927 you have 1/4 of the land tax delinquent, and a whole lot more that probably should have been at that point. So desperation forced us to give up the idea of farming, and there were 3 reasons in particular. One was called winter, which somehow was lost in that whole formulation of, yeah, it's all this great farmland. The second was markets. So this is a road going into Boulder Junction. So here's a guy, this is a photograph from Minocqua in 1897 or some darn thing, can't remember. Apparently this was his entire crop, 1 bushel of potatoes. Wow. So and now he's got to get it to market. Here's the road to get it to market. And you see the market there at the end of the road, right? No, where's the market? Where are you going to, even if you could raise a whole bunch of potatoes, where in the hell were you going to sell it? So we had winter and we had market problems, and then we had this issue called soil. This is all sand right here. And then they call this sandy loams or silty loams, which is, you know, if you compare our soils up north to anything down here, boy, there's just no comparison. Our soils are pretty darn poor. So the combination of those 3 things made all that land go tax delinquent, and ended up therefore becoming, the only thing we decided that we could do was grow trees. And we grow blueberries and cranberries and other things reasonably well as also, but that recognition came, and now we have 6 million acres or more of public lands in Wisconsin, almost all of it in northern Wisconsin, and it's because it was the land nobody wanted. It wasn't that John Muir or someone was standing up saying we should save it all. It was because we didn't know what else to do with it. And this was our last shot at doing something, which was to make it into public land and reforest it. In response to all that cutting and fire, a whole lot of white birch and aspen growing. We had up north all kinds of white birch bays and white birch everything's. White birch, you know, it's meant to burn. That bark ecologically exists because they have little tiny seeds, and you need to have an understory that's cleared out so those little seeds can get going. So it requires fire, and aspen just fills in everything with it. It's very lightweight seeds that blow for miles. So anyway, it was probably the largest human-caused forest type conversion in history, converting all of this young forest, old forest, into young forest, predominantly aspen and white birch, which we maintain a lot of the aspen today for paper, and I'm not a writer, so I'm okay with some of that by all means. So here's the modern forest of the Great Lakes states. I don't know if you can remember, whoops, I didn't give you that again. Remember that earlier slide, there was no yellow in Wisconsin. That's that aspen birch component, and the dark green that we had for pine, gone. Okay, so we cut down 99.8%. So what's left in all of the lake states, this is, oh God, I'm losing his name, forest ecologist from Minnesota. Freilich, thank you. Lee Freilich, way smarter guy than I'll ever be, gave these estimates. Northern hardwood hemlocks, which is what was dominant in northern Wisconsin, 0.2% in all of the upper Midwest, 72,000 acres, 35,000 are in the Porkies, 15,000 in Sylvania, 8,000 in the Huron Mountains, 2,000 in the McCormick Tract. So that's 60,000 acres in the UP in those 4 sites, leaving 12,000 acres, which isn't very much, for the rest of the UP of Michigan, northern part of the lower Michigan and northern Wisconsin. White pine, 0.6%, but almost all of it in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Very, very, very little left, not only in Wisconsin, but in Wisconsin and Minnesota as well. So what is left in Wisconsin? Part of the problem with this data is what makes an old growth forest old? What's the definition? And chapter 3 in my book is all about the definitions. And when all said and done, there's a political definition. Every county, every state, every national forest has a different definition of what's an old growth forest. So how old is old? How many of you here are 70 years old or older? Are you really old? Are you old growth now? Well, you know, when you were 50, 70 sounded like old growth, right? and now 70 doesn't sound like old growth so much anymore. 80 now, 80s, that's old growth, or so forth and so on. So even for humans, how do we define when we're old? Much less how do you define when a hemlock tree is old. A hemlock tree can live 400 years without too much trouble. The oldest one on record is 988 years old in Pennsylvania. White pines can live 400 to 500 years old. So what's old growth? If we define old growth as 150 years and older, which is a very liberal definition, well, maybe it's a very conservative definition. I don't know, but it's a definition that's out there, further out than what a lot of definitions are today, because we have so little left, or we're willing to say old growth's a lot younger stuff. White pine at 150-year-olds, it's just middle age, right? So anyway, if we look at 150 years old or older, we have 26,000 acres left in the state, more or less. Data from Randy Hoffman, Natural Areas DNR guy back when, who knew this stuff. And you look at hemlock, that's 6,644 acres. How many acres in a square mile? 640, right? So that's 10 square miles. 3 miles by 3 miles. You look at the white pine, 1,044 acres, that's just a little over 1 square mile. So it's a very, very little bit left. White cedar, quite a bit more, likely because it's just a mess to go in there and try to cut down in the swamps. And I put this statistic down at the bottom, not to harass golfers, but just because I thought it was interesting. Wisconsin has 505 golf courses, at least as of 2016 when I wrote this. And I estimated that each average 175 acres, so that's about 88,000 acres of golf courses in Wisconsin. And we have only 26,000 acres of old growth, about a third. And I thought maybe that's a little wrong, I guess would be the easiest thing to say. I think we could do a lot better. What are the values of old growth? A whole bunch of things. Scientific benchmarks, for one. How do you know what's normal if you don't have something that's left naturally as a remnant to compare to? How do we know the management we're doing mimics as best as it can natural functions? A lot of ecological diversity in these sites. I'm interested in a genetic repository idea. We're throwing a lot of stuff at our forest systems today. Who knows what's going to happen with climate change? Are these old trees, the few that we have left, are they the fittest trees, or are they just the luckiest trees that didn't get cut? I don't know, but I'd like to assume they're the fittest trees, and so maybe these are the ones with the best DNA that we need to really protect and be collecting seed from, because maybe they're the ones that can handle whatever we're going to throw at them here in the next century or more. Ecosystem services are talked about a lot in this conference. So collection of, a reduction of flood waters, carbon sinks, a whole bunch of stuff that old growth does. The recreation, aesthetic, and spiritual value. I assume most of you have probably been in an old growth forest. That's the reason you're here. And you know as well as I do that it pretty well drops you to your knees, doesn't it? You don't have to be a religious person at all to feel the spiritual, if you will, sacred, if you will, however you want to define that kind of feeling of being in an old growth forest, being in a place that's 400 plus years old with undisturbed qualities. Or go out to the redwoods and be in a place 2,000 years old. I mean, how astonishing is that? Economics, you can do a lot of economic big tree silviculture. The Menominees have been doing this for a long time and doing it very successfully down their way, a world-renowned silvicultural process that they utilize. And the value may simply be innate. This is God's or evolution's or a combination thereof, creation, and we ought to have the vast reverence for it. So quickly, some ecological processes of old growth. There are still a lot of people that say old trees are going to waste. And that just drives me absolutely crazy. So I do a stump speech, as it were. Leopold, everyone's read Stanton County Almanac, but go back and look at his November chapter, and he has a little piece on the mighty fortress. And he says, soon after I bought the woods a decade ago, I realized I had bought almost as many tree diseases as I had trees. But it soon became clear that these same diseases made my woodlot a mighty fortress, unequaled in the whole country. And he goes on to describe all the species that live in these dead and dying trees, all the den sites and decay-ridden sites that are just perfect for these various species. And he ends with talking about the prothonotary warbler. The real jewel of my disease-ridden woodlot is the prothonotary warbler. He nests in an old woodpecker hole. The flash of his gold and blue plumage amid the dank decay of the June woods is in itself proof that dead trees are transmuted into living animals and vice versa. When you doubt the wisdom of this arrangement, take a look at the Parthenothera. So I spent a lot of time in the book trying to say that dead and dying trees are every bit as valuable as living trees. And in fact, there's probably some evidence that they provide more ecological function in their death. And it takes a long time for these trees to rot and fully decompose. And in that process, they're providing habitat for an awful lot of things. So heart rot is good. I'm sure a lot of folks would disagree with me, but heart rot's good if you're an American martin and you're going to den up in that big white cedar, or if you're a porky, or if you're a fisher. We have 30 plus species of cavity nesters in Wisconsin. Pileated woodpeckers are condo developers in our forest lands. Most folks don't know, surprising to me, that black-capped chickadees nest in cavities. If you don't have a dead or dying tree on your property the chickadees nest in, you're not going to have chickadees unless there's one on your neighbor's property. Eastern kingbirds, great crested flycatchers, brown creepers do something interesting. They nest behind loose bark. So they tuck their nest back in there. So when that tree is sloughing off the bark, you know, it may not have a cavity, but there's that site for the brown creeper, which I find fascinating. Mergansers utilize broken off stubs of trees and cavities, as do wood ducks. So even a broken off tree can be of value. Why cut that down, you know, when a merganser can stick their eggs right in there. Dead trees still standing provide purchase. Here's an osprey mating, the 3-second mating moment at the top of the landscape. That's where they want to be, in those dead trees. Eagles put their nests in the top of tall white pines, 3/4 of the way up typically, and 3/4 of all nests in Wisconsin are in these tall white pines. And usually you want a kind of a flagged over crowns up there, because you're a big bird, and when you're flying in there, it's hard to get into something with all kinds of branches sticking out. And since we had common mergansers in that previous photograph, here's an eagle hauling a common merganser away. A friend took that photograph last year. Dead trees are great, of course, for heron and egret rookeries. And then we have all these ground nesting birds. And you know, it's coarse woody debris, coarse woody habitat, all those trees falling down, those trunks slowly decaying, all that debris on the ground. That's great stuff. I'm a big fan of random chaos in forests, because we have all these ground nesting birds. And if, you know, one of my all-time favorites is the hermit thrush. Hopefully you've all heard the song of a hermit thrush. Wood thrush too, for that matter. Just absolutely gorgeous songs, and they're nesting on the ground. And they want all of that debris on the ground to tuck their nests into, otherwise the predation is overwhelming for them. So here's a hermit thrush nest, and ovenbird nests on the ground as well. Of course, woody debris is good stuff. And again, most people will say, well, that's trees going to waste. And I worked as a carpenter, and I burn wood, and I've done a bunch of things with wood. So my book is not anti-logging. I'm fully in favor of wood product use. So it's not a rant and a raving against logging by any means, but it's a consideration of how we can do better in a lot of, and manage our forests in a way for some older age components, and maybe better for understory species and cavity nesters and so forth. Probably can't see this worth a hoot, but this is an example of a study done, and not an example, it's the information from a study done in 1997 on some lakes up north, and these are the avian species found on developed lakes versus undeveloped lakes. So these are all, the dark line is on developed lakes, where we have all kinds of cabins all along there. We have lots of birds, and what they found was the abundance of birds on developed lakes versus undeveloped lakes was pretty much the same. So most people would not notice a difference. They say, hey, I got a lot of birds in my lake, even though it's house, 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 house. And the person who might be visiting an undeveloped lake would have the same number. But the actual composition of those birds is very, very different. I don't know if you can see some of those things, but robins and mourning doves and catbirds and hairy woodpeckers and so forth. But then if you go to an undeveloped lake, and this is pretty fuzzy, I apologize, but it's a whole lot of ground nesters and shrub nesters. Blackburnian warblers aren't. They're up in the high hemlocks, but redstarts and vireos and parula warblers and brown creepers and so forth. So a very different cohort of species. on and along undeveloped lakes because you have old trees and lots of shrubs and undeveloped understories. All these dead trees, I'm big on dead trees, but everything in balance, right? Too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Ice cream, and old trees. Tree swallows use these for perches. If you're out looking for singing birds in the spring, breeding birds, where are the males? They're usually not hiding down. They're up on a perch somewhere where they can be seen. It's a big bar scene. They want to be known and heard so that the females would say, yeah, I want that guy, right? Perches on our lakes and rivers, wherever we have dead logs sticking out, where are we finding basking turtles, where are we finding snakes basking, anything that's cold-blooded that needs to get some sun, needs that woody debris in the water. Great study done by UW Trout Lake Station on a couple wilderness lakes down by Minocqua. Camp Lake here is divided just by a tiny little arm between the two northern lobe and the southern lobe. And anyway, they added a whole bunch of coarse woody debris to Camp Lake, and in a lake just over to here, it's called Rock Lake, they took off all the coarse woody debris, even took apart beaver lodges along the shoreline, took it out, and they compared first the number of species that were, and types of species prior to doing that manipulation in both lakes, and then compared afterwards. And what they found was where they added timber to Camp Lake, they found all kinds of fish species, in particular bluegills and perch and so forth, doing very, very well. And when they took away the coarse woody debris in Rock Lake, they found they crashed the yellow perch population, which then crashed the bass population, and they started eating one another. And then they started also eating, interestingly enough, mice along the shoreline because they were starving to death. So coarse woody debris in lakes, as everybody here knows from preaching to the choir, hugely important. And one of the things we first do when we buy a house along a lake is we clear out the understory and we make sure anything laying in the lake we take out as a general rule. And that's absolutely wrong. And then we blame the Indians and the DNR for ruining our fishing. And it's really all of us up north who are clearing out that lake shore of all that woody habitat that's in the water. So you all know this stuff anyway. And yellow perch eggs, well, you can read that. So the removal of those yellow perch from Rock Lake by dint of removing the coarse woody habitat was key to, it was a trophic cascade. So cleanliness is not next to godliness. Clean it up, criminy. It's supposed to be a rat hole. I love that cartoon. Some of us males particularly like that cartoon. We're all in favor of that cartoon. It doesn't really work well when we use it with our wives, but we try. So we need this random chaos on the forest floors along our lake shores and within our lakes. Dead and dying trees provide habitat. On the forest floor, they're nurse logs. It can take 200 years for a large hemlock to decompose, and in the meantime, all this moss grows on top of those logs. And they're just beautiful little micro ecosystems that hold on to all kinds of moisture. And if you've ever seen a hemlock cone, and I don't have that here, but a hemlock cone's wee tiny size of a root beer barrel, if you remember eating those when you were a kid, and the seeds are like the size of a pepper, and if they land on the forest floor and there's any kind of dry weather, the seeds just dry up. The little rootlets dry up. Lots of statistics on that. It only takes 2 or 3 days at most of dry weather or warm weather in the summer if the seed is landing on the forest litter, for those seeds to dry up. But if they land on the moss, they can make it through any kind of lengthy warm and or drought season. And so when you're walking old growth forest, a lot of times you see straight lines of trees, and that's because some big grandmother tree had fallen 100, 150 feet long, got covered in moss over 200 years, and on top of that nurse log, all these trees germinated, and now they're big trees. And that's why so it's interesting to walk in old growth and look for those straight lines. Nobody planted them, of course. Those are nurse logs. Tip-up mounds can take hundreds of years to fully decompose as well. And one of my favorite all-time birds is a winter wren. Hopefully you've all heard them sing. And they like to nest in that root ball. They stick, again, if you're a little bird, everything wants to eat you, so you're going to try to find great cover, and it's good cover to be in that big root ball. So where is what we have left? So I have a list here of what I thought were the 10 best combination old growth forests and places you can paddle simultaneously. That's not in the book. I didn't make that combo in the book, but in the book I list the 50 best old growth sites I think are left in the whole state, 40 in the north and 10 down south. And then I list 50 of the best of the rest that if we managed appropriately, we could add some acreage to those rather poor old growth statistics. So anyway, I'll run through these quick. Trying to take a picture fast because you can't write that down very quickly. One of the things I learned that fascinated me on this project where our oldest trees are white cedars on the Niagara Escarpment. Did anybody know that? I'm just curious, because I didn't. Good, nobody knew it either. So I don't feel quite so bad about my ignorance. So here's the Niagara Escarpment running, from below Door County up through Brown County, coming all the way down through Manitoulin Island into the Bruce Peninsula and down here to Niagara Falls. And Niagara Escarpment supports the most extensive old growth forest east of the Rockies. Who knew? And what they're supporting are all these little tiny trees coming off the edge of the Niagara Escarpment, these little tiny white cedars. A couple Canadians did a study, Michael Henry, Peter Quigley, and a guy named Doug Larson, wrote these books. The Last Stand, I really recommend it. It's all about the Niagara Escarpment and these little cedars. We were up in the Bruce Peninsula last fall looking at these guys up in Canada. Anyway, the oldest living white cedar that they've at least cored is 1,330 years old, germinated in 688 AD. And it's just a little thing, right? If you're a little tree coming up, gravity, the last thing you want to do is grow. Because if you grow, you're going to get heavy and you're going to fall out of your cliff. So these things grow like a millimeter a year. They hardly grow at all. So this is a little tiny tree. I'm sorry, I can't remember statistically how large that 1,330-year-old tree is, but it's tiny. They found a dead one that was 1,890 years old at the base of one of the cliffs. And so nobody is cutting these trees all along the Niagara Escarpment. You'd be nuts to even try because you'd have to rappel down there, and why would you bother? So interestingly enough, this is the oldest growth we have left and the most abundant old growth left in eastern North America. Interesting, isn't it? So if you want to go paddle and see this stuff, here I was messing around in Peninsula State Park looking at some of these cliff face white cedars. Well, just paddle your way up along the western shoreline, of Door County. Peninsula State Park has some wonderful trails that get you close to some of these cedars that are just gnarly things growing straight out and curving all around. I mean, they're just marvelous architecture in and of themselves. And these two Canadian guys came down to Door County, I don't know, a decade or so ago and spent a week. I don't know anybody else that's done any of these studies. This is a great master's or PhD study for somebody who wants to rappel the cliffs of Door County and core some of these trees. But those two Canadian guys found a 570-year-old white pine and a 616-year-old white cedar on the edges of these cliffs. So they're there, but it would be a wonderful study for someone to core a bunch of these, risk their lives doing it so we can have the data. We'd sure appreciate it. So our biggest trees where you could combine a paddle, so this is Archibald Lake, this is Cathedral Pine Stand up by Lakewood, north of Green Bay. If anybody's familiar with that area in the Nicolet National Forest. The state natural area is 874 acres, but there's a little tiny 22-acre stand of old growth. Anybody been to Cathedral Pines? Quite a few folks. Just a little site of huge old pines. Lucy Holt, the wife of Holt Lumber Company owner, begged her husband apparently to save these 22 acres so she could have Sunday school services in the 1800s in these old white pines. The forest guys up there have cored these trees. They're 376 years old. And a lot of them are 150 feet tall. So this is our best remaining, all of 22 acres, pretty darn tiny, of old growth white pine within this state natural area. But you can, anyway, put in them here on Archibald Lake. You can paddle across. It's a very pretty little lake, and there's a little place you can pull out right here, and here's the trail from Archibald Lake, and you can walk up to the old growth stand. So you can combine a little paddle with that trail. Here's my youngest daughter and me measuring one of the trees, a 48-inch diameter, 154 feet tall. Biggest pines historically were supposed to be 200 feet tall. The biggest we have left in the state on public land is about 155. So it's a sliding baseline. What we think is huge today, fairly moderate size historically. Most undisturbed sites that you can go to, and I think so interesting, are up on the Apostle Islands, somewhere around 1,300 acres of relic old growth left in there. They're due to lighthouse reservations. Apparently, wherever they built a lighthouse, and I think I have a slide of this, here's these lighthouses, they gave 200 acres to the lighthouse keeper. And they said, that's yours, we're not gonna cut in there, we're not gonna do anything in there because that's for you to utilize for your firewood or for anything else you wanna do with it. And so they ended up saving these sites, the best old growth site, and one I never got to. Out of the 100 sites I include in the book, this is one of 2 I never got to. That's 21-mile paddle off the dang coast, and I just wasn't up to it. Getting too old or something, I don't know. But there's a 200-plus acre stand with 400-year-old trees right at that lighthouse on far northern outer island. And what's so interesting about this, besides the fact that there's this old growth around these lighthouse reservations, is most of them don't have any deer, and they've never had any deer. And so you end up with this unbrowsed vegetative community in the Apostles that is of international significance. Don Waller is an ecologist out of UW-Madison, and he wrote a very long piece about this, but he says, you know, this is a living baseline record, a priceless living laboratory for us to understand. And if you've been up on the Apostles where there aren't any deer, the understory is riddled with Canada. Very hard to walk in, actually. It's a shrub that we see rarely in northern Wisconsin anymore because this is candy for deer. Deer eat this above and beyond, along with white cedar, any other species. They love those too. But on the Apostles, you have this unadulterated, as it were, undeered anyway, habitat, and you can kind of see how that's different, and it's pretty fascinating. If you don't believe me that deer have an impact on the landscape, that's a deer exclosure in Boulder Junction, and it's a hard quiz. Which side of the fence are the deer on, do you think? Pretty tough, huh? Do this on your own private property. Put up a deer exclosure. I think you'll be fascinated at the results. And make sure you also make it rabbit-proof down at the bottom too. Those rabbits can do a whole lot of damage as well. But deer in particular, eat 5 pounds of woody browse a day in the winter. And you add that to 1 million deer, and you end up with a whole lot of understory destruction. Franklin and Butternut Lakes, 15 miles east of Eagle River. You can paddle these 2 lakes, and there's all kinds of wilderness lakes here. This is Three Johns Lake and McKinley Lake and Bowes Lake. There's a number of undeveloped wilderness lakes, but you also have all this old growth in this area right here and along this shoreline. There's some, and some over here by Bowes Lake. And there's a 13-mile long hiking trail called the Hidden Lakes Trail, so you can combine your hiking with a nice campground there and some dispersed camping sites as well. Anyways, a great site. We've led a number of hikes there over the years. And one of the reasons we do that is we have done it with Mark Bruhe, who used to be the archaeologist for the Chequamegon Nicolet, now retired. And they did extensive studies on Butternut Lake, looking at the archaeological history there, and found people from 8,000 years prior living on Butternut Lake, and all kinds of fascinating information, of which you now have to erase your memory because you're not really allowed to see this slide. So we're going to continue. But anyway, it's fun when you're going to an old growth site to also know that people have been there a very long time. And that adds to that reverence. Plum Lake, Hemlock Forest, near the little tiny town of Star Lake up in Vilas County. You have this little isthmus of land between the 2 lakes, 747 acres worth, most of which is old growth. There was a big mill over here that cut, I don't know how many million board feet but they didn't, and they creamed the white pine out of it. You can't find much white pine, but it's some beautiful hemlock and yellow birch. Great place to do some paddling on those lakes, Plum and Star Lake, and there's another lake up here called Sausage Lake up to the northeast, and Ballard and Irving, and a couple friends here who live on those lakes. Just wonderful paddling in Vilas County. And there's all these trails you can walk around. So there's Ballard and Irving. I was mentioning Lake Laura. Little Star has just a few homes on it, lone trees, the wilderness lake. So great place to, if you're willing to put your boat up on the car and go to these little lakes and paddle, and then do all that hiking. Whoops. There's that Australian shepherd who's seen all that old growth wandering around with me, a little blowdown on that, the trail in that state natural area. A couple more and I'm done. Am I getting close to my time?
8 more minutes.
8 more minutes, perfect. Okay, the Guido-Rar Senior Tenderfoot Forest Reserve, owned by the Nature Conservancy. I was on the board at the time we purchased this. It was just a fabulous purchase. It's 997 acres, of which 500 or so are old growth. Almost all the old growth is over here in the eastern side. The western side had a whole lot of, oh, I'm losing it, but anyway, it wasn't old growth. You have to paddle to get there, so you have to go to the Palmer Lake boat landing right up here. Land O'Lakes is over here, Presque Isle is over here to the west, so you're kind of halfway in between. Paddle across Palmer Lake, onto the Ontonagon River, across Tenderfoot Lake, and you come to a little tiny pier that the Nature Conservancy put in, and then you can walk those trails. So it's a really neat combo place, and my wife and I, again, have led hikes over in there many years. I don't think we're doing one this year, but it's just a great site to go to. Highly recommend you doing that. The old growth is wonderful, and the paddle is beautiful as well. What's also neat about it is it's connected to a whole bunch of other relatively undisturbed property. So you have the Dunn Conservation Easement. It's private property, but the easement's owned by the Nature Conservancy. Then you have the Dunn Lake State Natural Area. Notre Dame owns, gosh, what is it, 6,000 or 7,000 acres? And a lot of folks don't know that Notre Dame owns all kinds of property. They don't just make quarterbacks, but they do limnology research. They own quite a bit down here in northern Wisconsin as well, and up in the UP. And they do limnology research along with the UW Trout Lake Station. Nationally known sites. So anyway, a great place for just wild land. This is the shoreline along Tenderfoot, undisturbed with all these white cedar and hemlock hanging into the water. Lots of coarse woody habitat, yay. And some pretty darn nice hemlock and some big yellow birch. Just a great spot. Right across the river from my house in the big city of Manitowish right there, this is that Frog Lake and Pines. I showed you that red pine with the fire scar. This is one of the better pine, one of the top 3 pine stands left in the state. And what's neat is you can paddle the Manitowish River. It flows right by our house. We own land on either side of the river right there. And you can go on down all the way to Turtle Flambeau Flowage. It's 16 miles to the Turtle Flambeau, and you don't see a single house after our house, which is pretty cool. And just meander all over the joint getting there. But, and you can go through some pretty nice pine along the riverbanks that they didn't cut. And so there's the Manitowish River Wilderness area and the State Natural Area. There's a couple wilderness lakes here, Mud Lake and Sandy Beach Lake, no development on either one of those. Plunkett Lake, no development on that one. Sherman Lake down here, no development on that one. So if you want to come to my house, we'll give you a cup of tea and we'll show you where to go paddling. In our area, it's just we're really blessed to be right there. Here's we're snowshoeing back there, my wife and I and a friend Bernie, and it's one of the big pines leaning in the snow. And there are a whole lot of purple bladderwort, if you're a bladderwort fan, on Frog Lake, little 42-acre undeveloped lake on that property that you can paddle as well. I think I only have one more. Tucker Lake Hemlock State Natural Area. This is in Price County. Off of Highway 70, and so you park down here and you cross over the South Fork of the Flambeau where it just begins coming out of Round Lake, and you hike this trail up into the Tucker Lake State Natural Area. This is a wilderness lake, I think, with 3 different campsites, so if you can paddle your way to there, there's a little trail that you can take to Tucker Lake, and you'll probably have that lake all to yourself. Really beautiful little lake. Here's my youngest daughter and dog hiking in there, and some of the trails around it. And then the best combo of hiking and paddling, period, in the upper Midwest is Sylvania, excluding the Boundary Waters canoe area. But if you want concentrated old growth as well as beautiful lakes to paddle, Sylvania is the best. 20,000 or so acres, of which 3/4 is old growth. My wife is holding up that yellow birch, thank goodness. And I imagine most of you have paddled Sylvania, but what a fabulous site. We have nothing like it in Wisconsin, and it would be such a dream if we could figure out how to do something like that. Long-term vision, we'll all be long dead before we'd ever see it, but great-great-grandchildren might, and why not? Why does Michigan get to have all the good stuff and not us? So I think I'm concluding here. You know what I'm saying? Me, for example, I couldn't work in some stuffy little office. The outdoors just calls to me. And again, it's not anti-logging, but I just found that funny. I'll end with this quote: "To stand amid the last uncut old-growth groves of giant cedar, white pine, and hemlock, some of the trees nearly 1,000 years old, is to be reminded that we're still capable of experiencing the greatest depths of peace and humility. Love these endangered places with all your heart while they're still here. A great society's legacy should be the wild places it protects, not the ones it removes. Love them not less, but harder and more passionately." So wrote Rick Bass. If you're interested, my wife and I are leading these paddles and hikes in July and August. And we have a website, manitouish.com, if you want to, if you had an interest and wanted to know what those are. You're not going to have time to write them all down, but you can check them out. We're going to a bunch of these places. Whoops-a-daisy. And shameless self-promotion, which my wife tells me I have to do, so I have to put that book up there. Hope that some of you might take a look at it. So I'm all done. Any questions? Sandy, we got time for a couple questions?
We have time for 3 minutes of questions.
3 minutes? I'll answer quick. Yes, sir.
It's not the old growth, but all through northern Wisconsin, you see the pine trees that were all planted in a row?
Yes.
When was that all done, and who did that?
Well, if you're looking at, yes, it's seen in northern Wisconsin a lot of pine trees planted in rows. We have a lot of industrial forest land and state forest land that are pine plantations. If you want to grow pines fast, you plant red pine. You plant it in our very poor soils. It does fine with those drought-ridden soils. It's not very disease susceptible. So an awful lot of red pine in northern Wisconsin and pine plantations, if that's what you're referring to.
Well, who did those?
Oh, well, the CCC planted a lot back when in the 1930s, and then the state and county and feds, and then private forests. There's a lot of industrial private forests still in the Northwoods.
Thank you.
Sure. Yes?
Yeah, I just wondered if the material you talked about today, do you elaborate on that more in your book? All of that, pretty much?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the answer. Do I elaborate on this way more in the book? Yes, a whole lot more. Yeah, so we could talk a really long time. So I spend 6 chapters talking about the history and ecology and a vision for the future, which I forgot to put in this particular talk of what we could do. And then I list those with maps and photographs, those 50 best sites left, and then the 50 best of the rest, and I list them by counties. And so people have maps to get to these sites and go play in these. Because, the way to conserve these sites is not to talk about them. If you walk in them, it's a done deal. It's kind of like banding birds. You're going to love birds forever, and you're going to love old growth.
Congratulations on finishing the book. I think it's amazing.
Thanks. Yeah, I was really glad before I died that it came out. That was good. Anybody else? Maybe one more? Otherwise, time for lunch, right? We're good then. Thanks.